we're in these wonderfully, we're so lucky to be in the environments that we are, and it just comes home to you every day what a difference you can make, not just to the individuals in front of you, but if led with conviction and moral purpose, what a difference we can hopefully all make in trying to make the world a better, fairer, more equal place, and so on. So yeah, it is something that really it came upon me almost unexpectedly as I was getting older, but it's a great place to be.
Welcome to the Independent School Podcast. Thinking and acting strategically is the key to both securing the future of your school and helping to build a more equal and just world. My name's Juliette Corbett. I'm a consultant, speaker and facilitator specialising in helping independent schools. In this podcast, I translate tried and tested strategy and fundraising techniques into a language that works for schools. So if you're a senior leader in a private school and you want your daily work to feel less exhausting and more strategic, and if you want once more to feel the joy of making the world a better place through education, then you're in the right place. Welcome, and let's get started on this week's episode. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode, where I'm really delighted to be joined by Jaideep Barot. Jaideep is head of Bristol Grammar School, and in the conversation that I'm going to be sharing with you today, we cover all sorts of topics from strategy, especially the importance of involving people in strategy, the centrality of bursaries in the missions of independent schools, and then also the role of leadership and the way that leadership has shifted and changed during the COVID era, and the way that Jaideep wants it to change back again as we come through the main crisis part of this pandemic. So before we dive into my conversation with Jaideep, I would love to explain a little bit more about his background, and you'll see the depth of experience that he brings to this conversation. So Jaideep Barot is the headmaster of Bristol Grammar School and has been since September 2018. Prior to this, he was the deputy head academic at Marlborough College, head of science at the Godolphin and Latimer School, and head of physics at Westminster School, which is where he started his teaching career. Just prior to that, he actually describes a brief flirtation with the city by being a member of Goldman Sachs. As a beneficiary of financial assistance during his own schooling that enabled him to join Manchester Grammar School as a boy, Jaideep is a passionate advocate for widening access to the life-enhancing opportunities provided by excellent schools. Really quickly, before we dive into the detail, I want to make sure that you make the most of the time you invest listening to this podcast. And the best way to do that is to make sure you grab a copy of my free ebook, The Strategic Independent School Leader. It outlines how to answer the 6 essential questions that will clarify your school strategy and secure its future. In the world of business, strategy can be full of jargon, but it doesn't have to be that way. This is a jargon-free tool tailor-made to help private school leaders think and act more strategically. Download your free copy today at www.consultjuliette.co.uk/ebook. So with no further ado, let's dive into my conversation with Jaideep Barot. So Jaideep, welcome to the Independent School Podcast. It is wonderful to have you with us here today.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
So I want to start by going back in time a little bit. I'd love to ask you about what is the root of your passion for education, having selected it as a career and then pursued that career all the way up to headship. What's the reason that you are passionate about this job in this sector?
Well, I guess if I think back, I really enjoyed school myself all the way through. I went to 2 or 3 different schools and I enjoyed them. I enjoyed learning. I had a decent propensity for it as well. I was, academically always doing all right. So that really helped. But I think for me, it was actually physics. I sound like such a nerd, but I absolutely adored my physics, especially as we got higher up the school. And while I really wanted to be a fighter pilot in the RAF, and the glasses that I was diagnosed as needing when I was about 13 or 14 put paid to that, I thought the next thing I wanted to do was physics and just do loads of physics and either become a researcher or become a teacher, a lecturer, because I loved it so much that I wanted to do the same. So a lot of people, when they talk about why they're in teaching or how they came in, will talk about the difference you can make for children and so on. But the question you asked is, how did I come into it? And it was really through a love of physics and wanting to share that. It's actually, once you're in schools, you realize quite how much more there is to it. And I was privileged to have a brilliant education where I went. But you don't realize that until you're much older, and you realize that all those things that were happening to you in school weren't by accident. All the extra opportunities you had, all the cajoling you had that was beyond the classroom and so on. And that's when you fall in love with the other side of it, which is where I am now. So the physics still remains a passion, but the idea you can really, you've got huge responsibility but privilege in being able to shape children and shape the next generation with all the myriad things that we can do in education. And that responsibility sort of is something that becomes more apparent, I think, the older you get and the more one gets into the profession. So it started from a love of physics, but it's grown into something really quite different, and that moral purpose.
Yeah, and I love that it's sparked by that one subject passion. Don't worry, you don't sound like a nerd at all. I'm married to a physicist, so you can't possibly sound like a nerd to me. But then it does evolve through time, doesn't it? And I think my journey was quite similar. So I kind of absolutely loved school, loved university, really got into the kind of the academic side, but also the variety of things that you can get into and involved in. And I quickly realized that I didn't want to become a teacher, but I did want to do something in this sector, and then finding out where my own skill set sat to enable me to have that same. And the roots and the values that you mentioned there, I think pretty much everyone I talked to in the sector who stayed for a long period of time, there is this sense of, at least when we reflect and we haven't had a really bad day, we reflect on the fact that there is a really deep-rooted passion for the difference that you can make to young people. And that's what drives us, isn't it, I think?
It totally is. And I don't know if that is just something that comes naturally with age anyway. As people get older, they're more reflective and they think more on why they're doing things and what the ultimate purpose is. I mean, I'm sure some of it is that, but we're in these wonderfully, we're so lucky to be in the environments that we are, and it just comes home to you every day what a difference you can make, not just to the individuals in front of you, but if led with conviction and moral purpose, what a difference we can hopefully all make in trying to make the world a better, fairer, more equal place and so on. So yeah, it is something that really it came upon me almost unexpectedly as I was getting older, but it's a great place to be.
Yeah. Similarly to you, I sometimes think that being thought of as a strategy consultant makes me sound like a kind of a very corporate management consultant. But actually, the thing that I love is being in a room when I'm asking people their own personal why. And we often start strategy development by thinking about, why am I really passionate about this school? What is it that I value about this organization, this institution, that can have such a positive impact on others? And I think a lot of people turn up thinking they're going to a strategy away day thinking, oh god, this is going to be pretty either excruciatingly embarrassing or pretty dull. And actually we're talking about their passions, their values, and I think that's when strategy can really come alive. I wanted to ask you as well, so you arrived in Bristol Grammar School as the head in September 2018. Did you quite quickly have a sense of the strategic direction that you wanted to take the school and the vision that you wanted to pursue, or did that sort of evolve over time in your first months and years in the post?
That's a really good question. I think I came with a reasonable idea of the direction I wanted the school to move in, and the school wanted to move in. So, in a sense, that's the ticket on which I would have been elected by the governors who chose me. I went to a very similar school in Manchester. I loved the sort of education I got there, and it was very important to me that as I was applying for headships, the first headship I got was at a school that really reflected who I was and what I was passionate about in education. And I've taught at a number of other really fantastic schools, but that were very dissimilar to the experience I had, whereas I knew Bristol Grammar was very similar. It was an urban, and one of the UK's ancient schools, an urban setting, quite well known for the academics, but also that idea of being the boarding school without the boarding, the full extra breadth of the education that comes here. But for me, the big thing was, even now, and I know that affordability for private schools and independent schools is always under the spotlight, and it has grown massive, the unaffordability has grown massively over the last decade or two. But even now, we have the sorts of people here who are sending children here, the sorts of parents who are sending children here because they really value the sorts of education they can get here, and they are, busting a gut to send their children here. And it's not everyone, but it's a much larger proportion than at many schools I've worked at before. And for me, that was a reason to come here. This is a place that was founded as a grammar school, was, in the days of the direct grant and in the days of the assisted places, even more recently, was still a very, very broad social mix. And the only thing that was a barrier to, or rather the only criterion on which you're going to be selected was whether or not you'd be able to thrive here. It wasn't whether you could afford to pay or not. And for me, that was very similar to the school I went to, and that's why I came here. And I know the governors and I shared a deep sort of sense of purpose that we should return to those days. So I had that when I got here, but that didn't mean that I knew how to do it or that I knew the school would be on side. And there was still an awful lot of talking, discussing, thinking, to do in that first year, which is pretty much what I spent the whole first year doing before coming up with our mission, aims and strategy to try and get going in that direction.
I love that you both started and kind of came back to, in your answer, the idea that the governors noted in you in that recruitment process that you shared a vision and an ethos, which meant that they wanted you to lead their school. And I think that is so important, that in actual fact, when you're hiring, in fact, this is true of hiring at all levels, but particularly at headship, if you can hire for values and ethos and vision, a lot of the skill set can then be either supplemented by making sure you have a good team around you or making sure that there's the professional development available. But actually, you're never going to do a good job if you're leading an organization which is not aligned with your own personal vision and values and what you want to be doing in the world. That's really important.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm just sorry, coming in on that, because of course the authenticity is required from the head, perhaps as much as anyone it is. But for me, it's exactly what I've learned perhaps over this process of hiring people over the last 3 or 4 years, that what I'm looking for is a real empathy with our ethos, with our vision, because as you say, everything else can be taught. There's 10 people can do the job sometimes, but who's the one that's really buying into what you're trying to do? That's very, very much the way in which we try to hire here.
Yeah, and actually there's a lot of empirical evidence research has been going on in the academic world, looking mostly in the corporate sector, but at that idea that you hire for values and then teach skills. And there's a lot of evidence to show that's a really successful way. Not least because it builds a school culture of people that are thinking in a similar way, obviously with the footnote of wanting to avoid the group think that can sometimes come with that as well. So you mentioned just now about having arrived at the school with a pretty good idea about the general direction and the kind of vision that you and the governor shared. And then that you went through a process to uncover whether the school community felt the same way, and the individual kind of specific challenges that the school faced and how you were going to overcome them. Did you have quite a formal process for that strategy development in that first couple of years?
Yeah, I think it was reasonably full. You can always look back at these things and wonder if you could have done things slightly differently or consulted this group slightly more and so on. But what I did, as a number of new heads do, is I saw every member of staff. I made it clear that I wanted to see everybody, and that included the support staff, or at least the managers of the support staff. Not every cleaner or catering assistant wants to be in front of the headmaster one-on-one, to be honest. But just to make sure that every member of staff knew I wanted to see them and ask questions about them and get to know them, of course, but also about the school and what they thought of it. And you got that fairly typical response you can get when you're going through something like this. Oh, wow, this is the first time anyone's asked me, or thanks for involving me in this. So you're starting to generate that buy-in, which it sounds a little bit I don't know, Machiavellian. It's not at all. It's just, you want to know these answers, and at the same time you're getting this corollary benefit that people are starting to buy in. So I had that with all the staff. I had parental focus groups invited in. We're going to talk strategy, what the school, why you sent your children to the school, what you think it does well, what you want it to do better, and so on. Talked to governors, of course. Talked to old Bristolians, our alumni, and other, key people in and around the city, to just try and get a feel for what Bristol Grammar was to people, but what it could also be. And doing that, at things like staff inset, really introducing, saying, look, here's our current mission and aims, what we're doing brilliantly, what we're not doing at all, what's missing, what what do you want to say about a pupil when they leave BGS? What do you want to be true of them? And really getting people to think that way. And through a process of doing that and repeating it and going back, and of course through the pupils, I almost forgot to mention the pupils, but the pupils were so valuable in that. And they led in terms of the values we came to. So at the end of the year, I've got something that really represents what the community thinks of BGS and what we can do. And it allowed us to rewrite the mission, to rewrite the aims very succinctly, and to make them really clear what it is we're trying to do, and to have 3 words that summarize the values that the pupils really felt, summarized what they wanted to be, the community as they wanted it to be. And it's kindness, it's integrity, it's rigor. And you know, that's not that different from school to school, but to have gone through a process where the pupils came to that, to have gone through a process where the whole community has got behind our 1-sentence mission, which is to provide this outstanding and rounded education to anyone, regardless of background and financial means, and to have 6 aims all under 1 sentence, really clearly written. It suddenly gave us something that we could all unite behind. And I've just seen, even through COVID and everything else, that the words we use, the words in the mission, the words in the aims, the words in the values are repeated in all sorts of areas across the school, in all sorts of conversations. And that to me makes me think, of course we can do lots of things better, but it makes me think that was time well spent in the first year.
Absolutely. I love that. I mean, that's basically a best practice strategy development process. So well done. I love the fact that the involvement was really authentic. It's definitely not Machiavellian. I think when you realize that actually the best ideas do not just come from a small group of people that happen to be in senior leadership positions and governor positions. The best ideas come from talking to the widest possible group of people and then genuinely listening to the feedback you get. And I think sometimes, you know, some of that feedback is challenging and it can be difficult, especially if you maybe are doing this process not as a new head, but as a head who's been through one round of this and maybe kind of after one 5-year strategic plan looking to refresh it. It's really hard sometimes to hear difficult feedback, but it's really important to have that integrity to be able to listen to that tricky feedback. And I love the fact that you're succinct in what you've come up with, your aims, your vision, the values. It's all about focusing, isn't it? And the fact that because it's so succinct, I think it's not a coincidence that then enables everybody in your community to actually live the strategy by using the words. So when you're seeing those words being used, it's because you've been really succinct and clear and focused in what it is that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope that's it. The acid test would be asking the staff, wouldn't it? And of course, I can say what I like here. But for me, knowing that I hear those conversations where I can go, oh, that's the exact wording we're talking about. It makes me feel, we're all on board. And we do staff voice, as you might expect as well. And where we are after 2 years of COVID is, one of the questions is about strategy and agency that the staff have in school strategy, and how they know about school strategy and how they feel about it. And what we get is really good, sort of above benchmark scores on what people think of the strategy and how behind it they are and what part they could play in it. But we're starting to see creeping in, I know the strategy, but I'm not sure what we're doing about it. And that's the next thing we're going to now have to focus on after 2 years of reacting really and eyes sort of, the eye line coming below the horizon. It's trying to raise it again and get us collectively to look beyond that horizon again and see how that strategy is now being pushed forward, even through COVID and beyond COVID.
Yeah, and I think for some people as well, for some staff, it's really easy for them to see how what they do every single day is delivering a strategy, whatever the strategy happens to be. Especially teaching staff, it can be quite obvious because obviously your vision is mainly educationally focused. But for some staff, and especially perhaps some of those support staff, guiding them to understand how what they do on a day-to-day basis helps to deliver the strategy, and then enabling people to continually innovate and have ideas that are listened to and funded as well. And actually there's some budget for these innovation and ideas that come up, that bubble up from anywhere across your school. I think that maybe is a nice next step to make sure that you're implementing the strategy, but there's involvement in that as well. That's still not top down. I mean, your strategy development process wasn't top down, it was involving others. So the implementation stage can be too.
I think you're absolutely right. I think what we're trying to do now, because let's fingers crossed, the worst of COVID or the worst of its effect on schools we're hoping that worst is past. But what we're doing is, so we've got some very specific key performance indicators related to those aims, and it's been really hard, actually. You think we got 6 aims to just measure whether you're doing it or not, but some of those aims, because they are about nurturing and challenging and knowing individual pupils, that's a hard thing to write a KPI about. So we're really starting to think carefully about those so that we measure something that's meaningful, not just that's easy to measure, and so that we measure something that, while being meaningful, the measurement process doesn't overtake everything else you're doing, because that would be a disaster, and it would just slow down everything that we're doing. But then from that, the strategy that you write to achieve those KPIs is something that we're trying to cascade down now, so that the middle leaders, whether it's pastoral middle leaders, academic, co-curricular, they've seen everything. They can see where it's cascaded from, knowing that they contributed to it in the first place, and thinking, right, now my part in this is going to be to do that. I want them to tell me what their part in it's going to be, so it's not top down, but so that the actual strategy and direction is very clear.
Yeah, so people can really own those individual action plans or the departmental action plans. And people often feel a bit more comfortable in the kind of the 12-month planning kind of situation as well. So, and that's something that's often within the skill set that you already have in the school. And teachers, for example, are very used to the idea of curriculum planning over an academic year. It's just the same techniques applied in a slightly wider sense to your strategic aims. I think your point on KPIs is really important, actually, because what gets measured is what gets done. And so being really intelligent and reflecting on what your KPI should be, it can take time, but it's worth spending time on it and crafting KPIs that genuinely, if you were to achieve those objectives, they actually take you in the direction you want to take. And also that you cull and get rid of KPIs at a regular basis that aren't serving you anymore. And it should be kind of a fresh sheet of paper with every new strategy, that you're looking from scratch at how you measure how we're achieving each of those aims as well.
Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned before, obviously with the vision of Bristol Grammar School being around opening up access to the excellent education that you offer, kind of regardless of background or financial income, obviously bursaries are going to play a significant part in that process. What are your plans and for bursaries going forwards? Do you have big plans in this area?
Yeah, as I say, that's very much it's central to the reason that I would have been given this job, I guess. We're already in a pretty strong position. I'd say our senior school, which is about 1,000 pupils, about 10% of them are on bursaries, averaging 50% of fee assistance. So on a reasonably significant level, we've got about 1 in 10, or just over that actually, who are on those bursaries. What we want to do is get to a position. We have our 500th anniversary around the corner in 2032, which in fundraising terms is just around the corner. and we want to get to a position where we have slightly more than doubled the number of kids who are helping in a similar way. So we want to get to a point where 1 in 4 of our children have access to means tested fee assistance at the level of an average of 50%. As right now, there'll be some right at the 100% and probably a greater proportion up at that end. But we're trying to make sure that anybody across the spectrum can come, so that what we're looking at really is that needs blind. We think by doing that, we'll be getting to the area of needs blind entry, which is what we're really after. So 10 years time, 1 in 4 kids at the school being on some sort of significant bursary provision. We think that's not too different from where the school was in the direct grant days, which we're using that almost as a target to hark back to. I speak to so many old Bristolians who were beneficiaries of the direct grant or the assisted place, and they cannot believe how lucky they were and what a great school it was, and they can trace everything that's happened positively to them back to that stage. And so we think that's a really good place to target, and that would be about right. And that obviously requires a lot of funding, and we've appointed a recent brilliant director of development, Nadine Latty, who's doing a lot of our work here and has taken us forward very quickly. But it's very ambitious. We're talking 12 million probably in the next 10 years. which for a school that has done fundraising, it's done reasonably well for a few years, but this is a game changer. That's a big thing. But sorry, I know I'm rambling, but the thing I want to add to that is what I'm loving about this is I've got the right people in place that along with that, it's not just about the money that's coming in. We've got the what we call the 3F strategy, and other schools will recognize something similar, no doubt, but it's the finding, funding, flourishing. So the funding we've spoken about there, but the finding is how do you get to a lot of children who would never think of coming to a school like this? We had a sixth former earlier this term, who joined us at the very last minute and openly admitted, as did their parents, they'd never heard of Bristol Grammar School, whereas we think that everybody knows who Bristol Grammar School is. Mm-hmm. So there's the finding, there's getting into communities where there's no history of going to independent schools or no thought of coming to the big posh school across the river, whatever it may be. And the third F is the flourishing, is that, they get here and a lot of them do really well, but it's such a different environment to what they may have ever seen before. And so, getting them here, finding them, getting them, being able to pay for them, but then making sure they're properly flourishing, not just surviving. And I've been chatting to a number of other heads at schools that do this really well to get some ideas for that. Yeah. So that's in a nutshell what we're hoping to do with bursaries over the next 10 years or so.
To be honest, JD, we can't talk about bursaries enough from my point of view. There's no rambling involved. This is a critical issue, not just because this is one of, not the only, but one of the key ways that our independent school sector can have an impact on social mobility, on social justice. That's the core for me. But even for those who are not fully persuaded of the urgency and the importance of that, this is also the way that we justify ourselves to a increasingly either perplexed or negative or ambivalent public, media, politics environment in which we have to justify that we are doing our bit. And for me, that's actually core to who I am and why I do my work. But even if you're not fully bought into that, we need to be in a really strong position when we come out of the COVID era, because the attention will be very strongly back on raising taxes. It will be back on the independent school sector in a negative way. And so this is a way that we have to make urgent progress to really have those positive messages going out into society.
I 100% agree with that, all of it. I just think, for me, this is going to sound, I hope it's not going to sound in any way bullish or combative, but for me, it's the schools that have really moved on since, say, 2017, 2018, when we had the pressure from Theresa May's government on the schools that work for everyone, and when we had all the talk and the fear of maybe Corbyn coming in and what he was going to do, and Rayner to the independent school system and so on. The real acid test is how much we've moved between that election and the next election, even with COVID and so on. And I think that, I want to be proud to be part of a school that is doing this because it's the right thing. And,
exactly.
and you're absolutely right. I know that's what drives you, Juliet. It's what drives me. And that, again, it's a corollary benefit that actually when people do try and beat us with a stick, we can say, hold on. We can't solve all of society's ills. We're not saying we can, but we can do our little bit, and we are, by God, that's what we're doing. Yeah. And I think that's a really important point.
I think the other thing that I find really interesting is that increasingly, so I do some feasibility studies for schools around bursary programs. So I'm talking directly to potential major donors, and it's interesting that increasingly actually they are spontaneously asking questions around not just the funding stage that you talked about, but actually the finding and the flourishing. And they are actually looking for reassurance, not just that, their money will be invested wisely, et cetera. So, financial prudence, those questions have always been asked by donors, but increasingly they're saying, how are you actually getting out to the right people? Yeah. And then once they're in, how are you making sure that your school is truly inclusive and that those individuals are thriving, and that actually this whole process is benefiting everybody in the school community, and that we all thrive in a more diverse, open kind of school community. So it's really interesting that this is also being driven to some extent from donors, or at least those donors who are thinking at length and reflecting perhaps around making a more significant donation to the cause.
Totally. Donors and advocates. We've asked somebody who's in a very senior position in public life, who's an old Bristolian, whether or not they'd be one of the one of our chief sort of drum bangers, I suppose. I can't find the word I'm
cheerleader, sort of.
Cheerleader, perfect.
Advocate, yes.
But we want to cheer for the campaign we're about to launch, and he's very much behind doing so, but wanted to ring up and say, look, I love the education I had here, and it was a great education, but it was by no means easy. And these are the issues that I had, and I want to know what you're doing about it before I cheerlead for you. To know that these days it's very different to what it was back, what it might have been like back in my day. And I think that's brilliant, because that level of engagement shows, I think, a desire and a love for the school, but also for what we're trying to do and for getting it right. And getting it right in that way, as well as being great for society as a whole, and social justice and social mobility, is great for our schools, because they enrich, the enrichment brought by having that broad mix back in a school like this for everyone is fantastic. But also it gives us relevance, because actually many people are wondering, why on earth would I pay 15, 20, 25,000 pounds out of my taxed income per child I have to try and get a kid to this school? And just the academic co-curricular pastoral, which we've banged on about for years, is not enough. And it shouldn't be enough. It should be everything else you're giving, with the inclusion, the diversity, the social mix, and that sense of service and responsibility and understanding of the privilege you've had here and wanting to give back. And I think that's what's going to make the best schools increasingly relevant in this age, which is becoming quite antipathetic towards the independent sector. Yeah,
absolutely. And I love that kind of advocate alumnus was asking for reassurance and detailed reassurance about the fact that things have changed. And I always love it when I meet potential donors or alumni or members of your community who are outspoken and vocal about their concerns, because they are saying things that other people only think and don't have the passion or the time to communicate to you. So listening really carefully to what those comments are, spending the time to articulate an authentic but compelling kind of rationale for how things have changed and the future changes that you are putting in place. I find as well that there's all sorts of tricky conversations potentially with potential donors. Some parents kind of wouldn't want to say, well, actually, I'm not sure I want to pay. I'm paying for this education, others getting it for free. I don't feel quite right about that. Actually, very few parents would voice those concerns to you, but the small number who will, and that allow you to have a dialogue with them around what that feels like, what messages might help to overcome that, or reassure them that, this does not mean we're going to have discipline problems in the classrooms, whatever their fears are. Genuinely listening to those and engaging with those people is really important, because so many other people may not, but may be thinking the same thing and just not vocalizing it, or at least not to you. Being aware of those conversations is really important.
I think you're right. You mentioned the echo chamber earlier and the danger of an echo chamber, and that's completely it. And when you've got something as compelling as this, you said, did you know which direction you wanted to take the school in? I feel great about the strategy that we've got and what we're trying to do, but actually it's a no-brainer. Who's going to argue that this is a bad idea? So then what you've got to do is you've got to make sure, right, are there some voices out there who will tell me how to get this right? Because everyone's going to say it's a good idea and everyone's going to say we should do it. And as you say, you're then in danger of being in that echo chamber where you're not listening to the small but important ripples. And I think that you're absolutely right, trying to find mechanisms by which you can get that sort of feedback, or just welcoming it when it comes rather than running away from it. While it's not the easiest thing to do, it's got to be one of the most valuable things you can do.
Absolutely. And it strengthens your messaging across the board. In fact, that leads me quite nicely into my next question, which was going to be about your leadership style and to what extent you feel that either your style or the style of your whole team has changed during the pandemic. And the link there, I think, is that actually during the pandemic, we have had, as leaders, had to listen to certain conversations which have been really challenging, really difficult, about people's fears around their jobs, people's fears around their health, people's uncomfortable relationship with change. Some of us thrive in change, some people don't. Is there a sense that you have reflected at all on your leadership style, or that it's changed at all since the pandemic hit?
It's a really interesting question, Julia. I think I'm part of such a positive community here, and I'm sure every head would say that, but I've been so gobsmacked. You always say that you realise the strength of your team, your community, your family, whatever it might be, in the hardest times, not in the easiest times. And that's definitely come across. The amount of time my colleagues at all levels have spent just sitting and listening to people who want to voice concerns, whether that's at the senior team level, whether that's middle leaders, whether that's just, teachers listening to each other and support staff talking to each other. There's so much of that. We've really encouraged talking and listening, but the amount that's been done has been phenomenal. And I think that's really helped us move forward as a community through this very difficult time. But in terms of the leadership that I display or that my senior team display, we certainly become much more honed at quick problem solving, at focused on pragmatic, practical solutions that listen to the problems that we've got, but very, very quickly try to solve them, rather than the sorts of deep and meaningful debates you might often have in quieter times over what the right thing to do is. It's just getting things done, because that's what we've had to do. And in terms of leadership, I mean, I remember learning early on in my leadership journey about what I think is called situational leadership. It might be Hersey Blanchard, I'm not sure, which is the directive leading that you give to people in a crisis or to very inexperienced people. Then you've got the sort of, I think it's coaching, which speaks for itself, then supporting, then delegating, and how you move up and down that with various different people depending on the task and their expertise and so on. And I think what we've done, not in any way that I hope has been dictatorial, is we've probably all moved down that ladder a little bit. So rather than the slower paced, I've often heard leading well is watching other people do a worse job than you and being fine with it, giving them the time to think about it, to make their mistakes and so on. But in a sense, we haven't had that time. So I guess, and I think our community have appreciated it, the fact that we've just gone in and said, right, this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it, because these are the issues that you've said we're facing, this is what the guidance says, this is what we're going to do about it. And I think that's what we've done. We've kind of moved back down that situational leadership a little bit, but in a way that I hope has been received, and certainly from the staff pulse surveys we get, has been received very well from our staff, from our parents, from our pupils and so on.
It's interesting because you're not the first head to have said that, exactly that, on this podcast. And there is a sense that during a crisis, I think people actually feel some comfort in being given just a directive in a way that in normal times that might be quite irksome. And actually, I think that most school communities have navigated together a sense that, yes, we do need to be a little bit more centralised in our decision making around some of these urgent decisions that need to be made, on an incredibly short timescale with an incomplete set of information in front of us. And I think what's interesting is the fact that generally, actually, across all sectors, including the independent school sector, there has been a sense over the last decade or two that delegated leadership is more powerful, that actually if you can train people and trust people to make decisions, and then that you're giving oversight to those decisions but not influencing them in a minute by minute kind of situation, that actually that is a more preferable way to lead a complex organization. And so it's interesting to see that slowly we hopefully will shift back towards a more delegated leadership where people have power at all levels of the hierarchy rather than it being centralized. There can be some almost like growing pains, almost kind of shifting from one to the other can sometimes be painful, especially if people have got used to just doing what they've been told and not really thinking about it, and they're quite comfortable with that, and then being reintroduced to the idea that actually, no, you take responsibility for your area, you come up with the ideas with oversight in terms of how things go.
Totally, yeah, and any organisation has got to be better if that's the way. It's got to be the best way. Hence what we talked about in terms of, here's the big picture strategy, here's the directions. Now you make a decision. What are you going to do? Of course, we'll talk, we'll chat. You can ask for advice, but you're leading this because we trust you to lead this. That's why you're here. That's why, as completely as you said, hire on values and train up the people later if need be.
Love it. I love that we're circling back to some of our earlier comments. That means that we are kind of coming towards the end of our conversation, and that we have a cohesive set of ideas here in this podcast, which is wonderful news.
It's a miracle. It
is a miracle. It's surprising how often it does happen. It's good. One final question for you, just very briefly. One of the things that I found about the independent school sector is that it's surrounded by myths, things that maybe used to be true but aren't true anymore. Is there any one common myth about our private school sector that you would like to debunk if you had a magic wand?
I can think of one, but given how high quality your podcast is and the guests have been in the past, I exclude myself from that. I imagine it's not a very original one.
Please share with us.
But it's just the classic, isn't it? We're not all Eton, Harrow, Westminster, whatever it might be. There's a huge variety within the independent sector. And one of the things I get across to prospective parents who I talk to every single day in this job is that I hope when you've looked around the school, you realise that there is something really special about this school, as there is with loads and loads of different independent schools who all have different strengths, different visions, different values, and that we're not all just, the high-end big boarding schools, that the image in the Times every time there's a private school story of, Eton kids or Harrow kids with boaters on and so on, that we're not just full of posh kids and privileged rich parents trying to hoard their privilege and stay away from society, because that's exactly the opposite of what we're about at Bristol Grammar School and at virtually every school. And I'm not denigrating those top independent schools like Eton, Westminster, Harrow either. I've actually worked in some of them, but I think one of the most difficult things to get across to people when you're having high level debate about social justice and social mobility and so on, you often realize that people just have no idea, and it's our problem, it's our fault. We've got to solve this, but people really have no idea what a modern independent school is like quite often, and you're arguing at cross purposes because they're arguing something that doesn't exist anymore in the main, but that the press has somehow managed to maintain as an image of private schools.
I think you're completely right, and you're right in a way that others have shared that, but I think what's unique about what you've just shared is the independent, so the uniqueness, if you like, of every school community as well. So you have that sense that yes, we're not what everyone assumes we are, or not everyone, but we're not what the media certainly often assumes we are, and yet also actually every school is different. And even though, and this is why I try to work with schools to get a really unique strategy, because every community has some things in common. We're all passionate about education, young people, etc. But there is always something that's slightly different at each of the schools that parents might be considering for their children, and so to be aware of that and alert to that is also really important.
Absolutely.
Jaideep, thank you so much for your time today. We've covered a whole spectrum of ideas, from strategy development processes and the importance of involvement and succinct aims and focus, the idea that bursaries are now a central part, and quite rightly so, of an independent school strategy, and that they should be, and that the challenge there is the finding, the funding and the flourishing of those young people. And then I think really interesting reflections around the role of leadership, and the fact that we have shifted because of the situational analysis that we're doing instinctively as leaders. We have shifted into a slightly more delegated form of leadership, and the importance of moving back to a more distributed form of leadership is really fascinating. So thank you, Jaideep. Thank you for your time here today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, Juliet.
And goodbye, and we will talk to you again next week. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for listening to the Independent School Podcast, the podcast that helps senior leaders in private schools to think and act more strategically, both because they want to secure the future of their school and because they want to help build a more equal and just world. You can listen in everywhere that podcasts are available. And if you want to catch up on previous episodes or follow any of the links that I've mentioned today, just head over to www.consultjuliet.co.uk/podcast.